Hello and welcome back to MVPDays, my session talking about domain controllers in the cloud, otherwise known as Azure Active Directory Domain Services. My name's Sam Cogan. I'm a solutions architect for a company called Willis Towers Watson, and I'm also a Microsoft Azure MVP. I blog regularly on topics around Azure and cloud at samcogan.com, and you can find me on Twitter at samcogan. In my day job, I get to spend time working with a lot of really cool new technologies that are taking advantage of cloud platform benefits and using cloud-first design. But as well as that, I also have to spend a lot of time working with legacy applications. I'm sure most people listening today will be in the same sort of boat. You don't often get to just work with brand new cloud-first applications, and you're going to have to deal with some legacy. So as part of this work to move these applications to the cloud, we've been looking at Azure AD Domain Services as a way of getting applications that expect to be able to talk to Active Directory to still be able to do so, but in a more cloud-centric manner. And so I've had the benefit of being able to work with this tool for a couple of years now, and in the rest of this session we're going to have a look at my experience using Azure AD Domain Services. Before we delve into Azure Active Directory Domain Services, let's take a step back and think about where it came from. So in the beginning, when Azure was brand new, we had Azure Active Directory. And I like to think the marketing people at Microsoft were feeling particularly happy with themselves on that day because they needed to name the new identity platform in Azure. And of course, everybody knows what Active Directory is. Everybody knows that it's the identity platform for on-premise. So let's call the Azure version Azure Active Directory. Everyone will know what that means. And yes, everybody did know what Active Directory meant. And so when we've got Azure Active Directory, it was very common for people to start asking the sort of questions we can see on the screen right here. And I bet most people watching this have asked at least one of these at one point when they were first getting used to using Azure. Because you expect them to be available in a product called Azure Active Directory. You expect to be able to join machines to the domain, to run LDAP queries, to do group policy, to look at DNS, and all the other things that are built into Active Directory. Surely something with the same name in the cloud is going to offer the same features. And the problem is that it doesn't. Azure Active Directory really isn't Active Directory. It's a user and group store as well as an application directory. And this causes a lot of problems and a lot of confusion, particularly with people who are new to Azure and think that Azure AD is just a cloud replacement for Active Directory. So after a couple of years of confusion and questions about features of Active Directory that weren't in Azure Active Directory, Microsoft released this new product called Azure Active Directory Domain Services. AAD DS really provides two functions. Firstly, it allows you to run Active Directory domain controllers as a service in Azure. And secondly, it lets you take your users and groups that you have in Azure Active Directory and push them into this cloud-based Active Directory instance. So, before we delve into the good and bad points, let's just have a look at what it is, how you deploy it, and how it works. And there are two scenarios we're going to look at for deploying AAD DS, a cloud scenario and a hybrid scenario. The first scenario is a cloud-only deployment of AAD DS. So this assumes you've got your Azure Active Directory instance already running and the users you've got in there have been created in the AAD tenant. And now you want to be able to use that to provide LDAP into your network. You want to be able to join virtual machines to your directory, all those things we talked about that AAD DS provides. So in this scenario, we would enable AAD DS and we would attach it to a specific virtual network in your environment. Once that's then attached to that network, it's available to all the resources in that network or any networks that are peered to it. And you will have effectively two domain controllers running your domain that are accessible to all machines. You can join machines to them, you can set GPOs, all the things you would expect to be able to do with domain controllers. The users that you created in Azure Active Directory and the groups you created there will now be available in Active Directory for your machines that are connected to your AAD DS tenant. The second scenario is the hybrid approach. It's similar to the first, except in this scenario, we are synchronizing users from our on-premise domain up to Azure Active Directory. And so in this sort of scenario, you're effectively going to have two synchronizations. You're going to have the users synchronizing from on-premise up to Azure Active Directory, and then you're going to have them syncing across to your AAD DS domain as well. So your users and your groups are going to be accessible both on-premise and in your AAD DS tenant. So that's the two scenarios for deploying AAD DS. We're now going to have a quick demonstration of how you go about deploying AAD DS in a cloud-only scenario using the Azure Portal. Okay, so here we are in the Azure Portal, and we're going to go ahead and create an instance of Azure AD Domain Services. Click on that. And the important thing to remember is that you need to have selected the AAD tenant you want to create under when you get into the portal, but also the subscription that houses the VNet that you're going to have this join also needs to sit underneath that AAD tenant. It can't be under a different tenant. Go ahead and click create, and the create experience is fairly straightforward here. So it's going to give you the directory name, and you specify the DNS name you want to use for that. It will take the default, the subscription, and then pick a resource group and a location. Click OK. Then you're going to need obviously to specify a virtual network that you want to use for this. We're going to create a new one at this point. We'll take the defaults here, and you need to give it a subnet, and we'll call it the AAD DS. One thing to bear in mind is that this subnet that you're going to use needs to be dedicated to AAD DS. You can't use it for anything else. So when you deploy AAD DS, it's going to create a group called AAD DC administrators, and anyone you put in this group will have administrator rights on the tenant. So we need to make sure that has the correct users. You can do this now, or you can do it later, just using the group panel of AAD. So we're going to pick that up later. You can specify which users are synchronized to AAD DS. We're just going to take all of those. And now we're ready to go, and we will click OK. That's going to go ahead and create the tenant. Now, one thing to bear in mind here is this will take a while, and by a while I'm talking an hour or so for this to deploy, so you're going to want to go away and come back when that's done. To save us some time, I've hopped over to a different tenant, and I've already got a AAD instance up and running, and so we can click on that in the portal, and you can see in here there are a fairly limited amount of options you get actually in the portal. So you can view the health of the domain, and you can look at the properties and so on, but there's very little you can actually configure in here. There are, however, a couple of steps that you're going to need to undertake once the deployment is complete. So the first one, and actually I've already done this here so it's not going to show up, but the first one is to configure your VNet to use the AAD DS instance as its primary DNS source. You can either have the wizard here do it, or you can manually go and configure your virtual network to have those set as the primary DNS servers. If you want to configure your VNet manually to use these as DNS servers, you can go to the properties page, and you'll see in here the IP addresses of the two instances of AAD DS that you're going to use, and so that's what you'll feed into your VNet as primary DNS servers. The second thing is mentioned here is enabling the password hash synchronization. So by default, when you're using AAD, particularly if you're doing a cloud-only scenario, the password hashes aren't synchronized. So this will be enabled when you deploy AAD DS, but they don't actually get synced until the user first resets their password. So you're going to have to either have users reset their passwords or reset the passwords for them and get them to change that the next time they log in. Okay, so here I've logged on to a machine that is joined to the AAD DS domain we just looked at, and I'm logged on with a user that is a member of that administrator group. So I can go into Active Directory users and computers, and we can see that we've got the domain here, the same one we looked at before, and we've got the AAD DC users OU, and inside that are all of the users that are members of my domain. We've also got some custom OUs that we've created, and if we have a look in group policy, we can see we've got some policies that we've created and applied to different OUs as well. So from this perspective onwards, it really looks like a normal Active Directory domain that you can use in the same manner as you've always done on premise, with some exceptions that we're going to take a look at now in the rest of this session. Okay, so you've seen how it works, you've seen how to deploy it and how you get it configured in your virtual network. So let's take a look at the important bits now. What are the benefits of using this, and more importantly, what limitations are there that you need to be aware of before you think about using this? So we'll start first with the benefits. And obviously one of the big benefits of using this is that it's pretty simple to deploy. If you want to deploy IaaS domain controllers into Azure, you're going to have to obviously go ahead and deploy the virtual machines, set them all up on your VNet, deploy Active Directory, configure all of that, set up your second domain controllers and your replication and all of those things. Deploying AAD DS is pretty much clicking a couple of boxes in the portal, and the platform will take care of everything else for you. Second point, on management overhead. So because this is a platform as a service, you don't have to take care of managing the virtual machines that underpin this. Microsoft is going to deal with managing all of the virtual machine patching, all of the host updates, all of the Active Directory updates, all those sort of things are going to be managed for you by Microsoft. It's highly available right out of the box, so when you deploy ADDS, you're going to get 2 domain controllers in that instance, and if there is a problem with one of them, then Microsoft will take care of dealing with that, and ideally you wouldn't see any downtime. It's all handled by the platform underneath. Using AADDS is the only way you can achieve synchronization in the opposite direction to what you would normally do. So we talked about the on-prem version. Obviously you're syncing from on-prem up to Azure Active Directory. You can't go the other way. You can't sync users that were created in the cloud back down to on-premise, unless you are using AADDS, because the synchronization goes from AAD to AADDS. Your users in the cloud are kind of the primary source, so you do have the synchronization of cloud users in that direction. Because it's all being backed by Azure Active Directory, all of the functionality you get with Azure Active Directory users is available here. So things like just-in-time admin support, being able to have your users who are managing your AAD domain have to elevate themselves before they implement any changes to the directory, before they manage users, groups, and so on. AADDS supports group policies, so you can configure group policies and apply them to users and groups and machines, with some caveats that we'll talk about in a little bit, but you can configure group policies in the same way you've always done on-premise using the GPO support in AADDS. AADDS has support for all the protocols you'd expect, so LDAP, NTLM, Kerberos, all of those are available. And the last point there, AADDS has the benefit of being able to deal with synchronization of users and provide domain controllers in the cloud without needing to configure things like VPNs or express routes back onto premise. Now, there are a few issues that were around when AADDS was first launched that have now been resolved. I thought it was worth just running through a few of these, because if you read some documentation or if you read some old forum posts and so on, you might see examples of these being cited where they're not actually problems anymore. So the big one is that originally when AADDS was released, it was released as a V1 a service management resource. So it was only available in the old portal and it could only use classic VNets. That's no longer the case. AADDS has moved to the ARM platform and you can deploy directly into V2 VNets now without a problem. Again, when it launched, it wasn't possible to configure custom OUs or custom GPOs inside AADDS. This is no longer the case. You can now create OUs and you can create GPOs. Also, when AADDS launched, there wasn't any support for Kerberos delegation. You didn't have the rights to configure any sort of delegation, and that was a big problem, obviously, if you were using applications that required delegation, or you were using tools in Azure like Application Proxy, which was going to require this as well. So that's thankfully now gone away. You can do Kerberos delegation. You are limited to using the newer resource-based delegation, and we'll talk a little bit about that more in the future, but you can do delegation. And the final point on there, and this ties back to the whole ARM classic stack options, because it's now moved to the ARM stack, you can now use AADDS in cloud service provider subscriptions. Okay, So we've talked about the benefits and the functionality available in AAD DS. Time now to have a look at some of the limitations. And we're going to have a look here at the top 6 limitations that I've called out really as being what I think are sort of the top issues people are going to have concerns about and that are going to prevent people from being able to move to using this service. So the first issue, and in my opinion probably the biggest issue and the one that's going to prevent the most amount of people being able to use AAD DS, is its support for multiple regions. AAD DS doesn't have any support for multiple regions. When you deploy AAD DS, like you saw earlier, you select a VNet to deploy to, and obviously the VNet is in a specific region, and your instances get deployed there. Once you've done that, that's your one deployment of AAD DS used up, unless you delete it and recreate it elsewhere. So you cannot deploy instances in other regions. You cannot have DR instances in other regions to support failover in case of a full region outage. And you cannot deploy them additionally in other regions or other subscriptions or other virtual networks for other applications to use. You are limited to that one deployment. This is something that Microsoft are aware is a big issue and is something that needs to be dealt with. But for the moment, this isn't available. And so if you're going to use AAD DS, you're stuck with using that one region. Domain admin rights is going to be an issue for a number of people as well, because effectively you don't have any. You do not get domain administrator rights or enterprise administrator rights on your AAD DS instance. You get specific rights scoped to doing the specific things you're allowed to do. So this is mainly focused around user administration, group administration, GPOs, setting up delegation, OU creation, that sort of thing. So for example, you don't have enterprise admin rights, so you cannot extend the schema, so you cannot install things like Exchange Server or SharePoint. If all you're using AAD DS for is a user group store with some GPOs and so on, then that might not be an issue for you. But if you are looking to use this as a full implementation of Active Directory running in the cloud and need those rights to be able to do so, then AAD DS isn't going to do what you need. User creation in AAD DS is an interesting one, because the assumption is made that Azure AD is going to be your primary source of truth for users, not AAD DS. You can create users in AAD DS using Active Directory users and computers, but those users will only exist in your AAD DS instance. They will not be synchronized up to AAD. Users that are created in AAD will be synchronized into AAD DS, but you are unable to edit them in AAD DS, and you are unable to move them outside of the organizational unit that gets created for you. Hybrid sync, and by this I'm talking about the scenario we discussed earlier, where you've got your on-premise domain which is syncing users and groups up to Azure AD and then across to Azure AD DS. And the thing to bear in mind here is that your AAD DS domain is not a replica of your on-premise domain. Your AAD DS domain is a completely separate directory that just happens to have the users and the groups from your on-premise directory and the same domain name. Other than that, it is completely separate. So nothing beyond users and groups are going to be synchronized across to AAD DS. You're not going to get GPOs synchronized, you're not going to get your OU structure, you're not going to get your DNS records or anything like that synchronized across. So I mentioned earlier in the benefits of AAD DS that you can create custom OUs and GPOs, and that is true. The reason why they're here in some of the issues is the fact that you are limited to what you can do with them. Primarily because what we talked about earlier were the fact that your users that are coming from AAD, which is going to be your primary source of users, are restricted to being in that user's OU. You can't move those users outside of that OU and apply GPOs in a more selective manner using an OU structure. For machines or for users that exist only in AAD DS and you don't care about them being synchronized across, then absolutely you can put them in an OU structure that you like and you can apply GPOs selectively to those OUs. But for users that are coming from AAD, you're limited to them being in that specific OU. And therefore you then have to get a bit more creative about how you filter your GPOs. Finally, the last big issue is around Kerberos delegation. And again, I mentioned this in the benefits, you can do Kerberos delegation, but you are limited to resource-based delegation. And the reason for this is because of the fact we mentioned earlier that you don't have domain admin rights. Therefore, you don't have the rights to be able to create service principal names. Therefore, you have to use the resource-based option. Now, this might not be an issue for most people because the resource-based option is generally the better approach to use anyway. But if you've got applications that are expecting to be able to use the standard delegation approach, then you might find yourself with some issues because you can't do this in AAD DS. So those 6, I think, are the biggest showstoppers that are going to prevent you from using AAD DS if they affect you. But we've got a few more listed here just to be aware of. So firstly, AAD and so AAD DS doesn't really have any support for multiple domains or forests in a synchronization. When you synchronize a multi-forest instance, you are going to get a flat structure in AAD. You're just going to get all of the users listed in a flat manner. I mentioned earlier that LDAP is supported using AAD DS. You can run LDAP queries against those domain controllers. They are read-only queries though. You cannot write back to the domain using LDAP. This third one here is a real pain, I think, is the fact that password lifetime and lockouts don't sync. So if you have users in AAD DS who manage to get themselves locked out or passwords expired locally, these do not sync back up to AAD. AAD DS doesn't support B2C or B2B users, so if you've invited guest users and similar, those are not going to be synchronized across to your AAD DS tenant. AAD DS is not supported in every region. It's much better now than it was, so most of the major regions are going to support AAD DS, but some of the smaller regions still don't have this enabled yet. The last point on there is that AAD DS can be quite expensive, particularly if you're looking at small workloads. AAD DS is charged based on the number of objects in your directory, and the minimum number of objects you can pay for is 25,000. Which works out at roughly in the region of $90 to $100 a month for that workload, regardless of whether you actually have less than 25,000. So if you're just trying to deploy a very small workload here that only has a few objects in it, you could end up paying a fairly reasonable amount of money just because you only fit into that lower tier. Okay, so we've looked at the benefits of AAD DS, we've looked at the limitations and the issues of AAD DS. So now we need to decide, okay, when do we use this? When is a good use case for me to use AAD DS? And when is a bad use case when I shouldn't be using? So let's take a look at some of the good use cases first, because there are some really, really good scenarios for using AAD DS. One of the primary ones, and what it was originally marketed for, is when we're talking about lift and shift. When we've got applications that we already run on-premise and we want to move them to the cloud, and they need to be able to access Active Directory or talk LDAP and so on. If we want to move them to the cloud, they're going to need to have some domain controllers to talk to. And in that scenario where you're just using these domain controller instances to service these applications, AAD DS can be a really good use case. Another good scenario for this is when you need to extend your on-premise domain into Azure, particularly when you're talking around user administration. This is a scenario particularly around administration. So let's say you've got resources in Azure and you need, particularly virtual machines, that you need your operations team to be able to go and manage. You'd like them to be logging onto those machines using their on-premise user accounts with their on-premise passwords and so on. And so an easy way to do this is to deploy AAD DS, hook up those machines to this domain, and now they can be logged onto by your support team. There are some scenarios that actually require the use of AAD DS. In particular, what I'm thinking about here is the recent introduction of access control lists for Azure files. So recently they've introduced functionality that allows you to provide ACLs on these Azure files using Windows users, but it assumes those Windows users are coming from Azure AD DS. So there is a requirement for using AAD DS to provide this service. AAD DS can be great for provisioning test environments that just need a directory to talk to be able to run some tests or to deploy some applications and test those applications and so on. If you don't need that domain to be production ready, and you don't care about replication and DR and all that sort of thing, all you're really looking for is a couple of domain controllers for your applications to be able to hit and then tear them down again when you're done. It can be a great solution. Similarly, something like an isolated remote desktop environment is going to need Active Directory for things like remote desktop gateway and the session host to talk to and be able to log on users. But if you're running this in Azure and you don't need it to be connected back to your corporate network and so on, you just need some domain controllers to be able to service RDS, this can be a great solution. Okay, so we've looked at some of the good use cases. What are the bad use cases where we shouldn't be using AAD DS, where it doesn't fit and it isn't a solution to these problems? So the first one is based on what we talked about earlier. It's going to be very difficult for a lot of people to justify deploying production workloads using AAD DS while you're still limited to only having it in a single region. If you've got to implement disaster recovery, AAD DS isn't going to work for you because you cannot put it in a second region. The second thing on there, and this is really a bugbear for me, is AAD DS is not a replacement for your on-premise domain. I've spoken to a number of people who've seen this and go, great, we can just throw away all of our domain controllers and we'll just put everything in the cloud. We don't need on-premise domain controllers anymore. AAD DS is going to do that for us. And in my view, it's a terrible idea. It's really not something you want to do, because you are firstly relying on something that you can only put in one region. You're relying on something that requires a connection from your on-premise environment up to the cloud. Even if you're using ExpressRoute or VPN, if that goes down, you've lost your authentication now. You can't use that anymore. You'll lose all the abilities that require domain admin rights in your domain because you've only got those limited sets of rights, so you can't do anything beyond what Microsoft allow you to do. And generally, it is not a great solution if you are just looking to remove your domain controllers. Anything that you need to do that requires you to be domain or schema admin or enterprise admin is not going to work for you here. So if you're looking to run Exchange in Azure, or you want to do SharePoint farms or something like that, then this isn't going to work. It isn't going to give you the rights that you need to be able to do that. Another key point here is if you can't support synchronizing your password hashes up to Azure AD and then on to Azure AD DS, then AAD DS isn't going to work for you, because without that password hash sync, obviously nobody's going to be able to authenticate on the AAD DS side. And the last point here is about using AAD DS for disaster recovery, in particular for disaster recovery of your on-premise domain. So if you have a failure on-premise, failing over to AAD DS. This isn't going to work, and this is based on what we talked about earlier, the fact that AAD DS is not a replica of your on-premise domain. It is another domain that just happens to have your users and groups in it. So you're not replicating everything else you need, your GPOs, your OUs, and so on. And therefore it is not really a solution that allows you to fail over to if you have a disaster. So let's just sum up what we've talked about. And the third thing I want to be clear about is that AAD DS can be a great solution for certain scenarios. We've talked a lot in this session today about the limitations and the downsides of AAD DS, but that doesn't mean that AAD DS is not a good solution. For specific scenarios it was designed for, it can be really great. There are a number of limitations and restrictions in AAD DS. You need to be aware of these, and if you can work with them, if they work for you, then that's going to be great. But if they don't work for you, then you're going to have to look at alternative solutions. I'll say this again and re-emphasize from the last slide. AAD DS is not a replacement for your on-premise domain controllers. Please do not try and make it do that job. It is not what it was designed for. And as I've said, AAD DS isn't the solution for everything where you need domain controllers in Azure. It is perfectly valid to look at deploying IaaS domain controllers if you need the functionality they provide that isn't in AAD DS. In particular, if you need multi-region support, if you need replication between domain controllers in different regions for DR and so on, running IaaS domain controllers is still a great scenario. Yes, you still have to manage them, you have to manage the updates and so on, but at the minute that's the only way you're going to support that scenario. And so that brings us to the end of the presentation. If you've got any questions on Azure AD DS or anything we've covered in today's session, or just in Azure in general, feel free to contact me either via Twitter or my website, and I'll be happy to answer those for you. Thanks very much for watching today, and enjoy the rest of MVP Days.